All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I want to welcome everyone to NCRC's Just Economy series with our renowned guest speaker, Richard Rothstein. My name is Jen Jones. I serve as NCRC's Chief of Membership and Policy. For those of you less familiar with NCRC, we are a 600-member grassroots network dedicated to promoting racial and economic equity in housing, small business lending, and basic banking services. Our coalition is comprised of community and economic development corporations, municipal government, faith-based institutions, civil rights groups, minority and women-owned business associations, and local service providers. A few housekeeping things before we get started. You'll notice that all of you are currently muted. I'm happy to say that we've had over 500 people register for this event. Folks are still sort of joining us online right now. So to make sure everyone can hear during Mr. Rothstein's presentation, we've muted all participants' lines. We are saving questions for the last, I'd say 25, 30 minutes. But please feel free to submit questions through the QA function in the controls at the bottom of your screens at any time. Questions will only be visible to the asker and the panelists until they've been answered. And with that, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce the main attraction. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He has spent much of his career researching and writing books and articles about the history of segregation in education and housing in the US. Please join me in giving him a tremendous Zoom welcome, Mr. Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much. Can you see me? Am I on? Okay. Does that work? Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Jen, for that introduction. As you all know, we had a civil rights movement in the 20th century. Civil rights lawyers began by challenging segregation in law schools because they figured that even the most reactionary judges might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated and inferior law school. And then that led to the abolition of segregation in colleges and universities. And that in turn led to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, with which you're all familiar, that prohibited legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. That Brown decision then gave impetus, inspiration to a growing civil rights movement that, as you all know, eventually abolished segregation in lunch counters, in buses, interstate transportation, public accommodations, employment, and the Fair Housing Act that prohibited discrimination in future sales and rentals of housing. During the course of that civil rights movement, people lost their lives. The movement engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. There was nothing easy about that movement. But by the end of the 1960s, many Americans, I'd say most Americans, came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong. It was harmful to both blacks and whites. It was immoral. It was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And yet, with that understanding, and with all the victories that the civil rights movement won in the mid-20th century, it pretty much disbanded after 1968 and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. I imagine that many of you have lived in more than one as well. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be that, having come to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, how could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? We're more segregated today than at any time in the last 70 years in this country. I think partly it's can be understood that redressing segregation is hard. It's harder than the other segregations that we addressed in the 20th century. If we abolish segregation in lunch counters or restaurants or public accommodations, the next day you can go to any restaurant, ride in any bus, and things look very different in those respects. But if we announced that we were going to abolish segregation in neighborhoods, things wouldn't look much different the next day. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Northerners, Southerners, all of us, what we've done is adopted a national rationalization, a myth, something we tell ourselves to excuse ourselves from assuming our constitutional obligation as citizens to do something about residential segregation. And that myth goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation in colleges and universities and public accommodations and interstate transportation, swimming pools, water fountains, all of that was done by government. We say it was unconstitutional. It was a violation of civil rights. If the federal government was requiring segregation in interstate transportation, for example, it violated the Fifth Amendment. If state and local governments were violating civil rights by requiring segregation in local facilities, it violated the 14th Amendment. And if we have a constitutional violation, we all understand that we have an obligation to do something about it, to redress it. Residential segregation, though, we tell ourselves it's something entirely different. We say that residential segregation, oh, that wasn't created by government. That was done because private homeowners and landlords refused to sell or rent to African Americans in white communities, or maybe actors in the private economy, banks, real estate agents, not public servants, discriminated in how they carried out their private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves that blacks and whites just like to live with each other of the same race. That's why we have so much segregation. We feel more comfortable that way, being separate. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just economic differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites and can't afford, many of them can't afford to move into all white neighborhoods. All of these individual bigoted but private sector activities, income differences, self-preferences is what's created residential segregation. And if it happened by accident, if it happened naturally, it can only unhappen naturally. It's too bad, we say. We don't like living in an apartheid society, but we say it's not our obligation to do anything about it. Well, I spent much of my time, as Jen told you, writing about education policy. I came to the conclusion that the education policy that we were following in this country in the 1990s and 2000s was wrongheaded. It was based on the idea that the reason that African American children had lower incomes, lower achievement rather, than whites was on average, was because teachers and schools had low expectations for those children, and that if you could somehow force teachers and schools to pay more attention to Black children, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought it was a ludicrous theory, but it was supported across the political spectrum. As you may recall, in 2001, we passed something called the No Child Left Behind Act, which required that children be tested every year in math and reading. And it predicted that if we simply tested children and held schools and teachers accountable for their achievement, the achievement gap would disappear in just a few years. As I said, I thought it was a ludicrous theory. I wrote column after column about it. For example, I remember writing one about asthma. As I'm sure you know, African-American children in low-income urban neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children, 4 times the rate. They have asthma at a higher rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And I try to explain that if a child has asthma, not everyone, but if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child without asthma to be up at night wheezing, come to school sleepless, drowsy the next day. And no matter how much you test the child, no matter how high teacher expectations are, a drowsy child can't learn as easily as a child who comes to school well rested. And there are so many of these conditions that create lower achievement for disadvantaged children, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning that has an actual impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity. You can go on with all of these. When you add them all up, you've explained most of the achievement gap. And it's not because teachers have low expectations. If a child comes to school in poor health, insecure, homeless, that child is not going to be able to learn no matter how high teacher expectations are, no matter how much a school is held accountable for that children's achievement. Well, this is what I was thinking about maybe 20 years ago, and then I began to realize that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. It's another thing if you have a school where every child has one or more of those conditions. How can you ever expect those schools to have the same average achievement as a school where children come to school healthy and well rested and from secure homes? Well, we call those schools segregated schools, where we concentrate children like that, and schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 40 years. More segregated than they ever have been. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which those schools are located are more segregated. So I began to think that neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. That's how I came to this work. And that was the impetus between the book, The Color of Law, that I subsequently wrote. And then thinking about this, I read a Supreme Court decision in 2007. The decision involved the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. In both districts, the administrators had decided that segregation was a problem, and they implemented a very token plan to try to minimize the segregation of their schools. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend, but if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would help to minimize segregation. It was a very, very trivial program. For example, if you had a school that was all white or mostly white, and there was one place left in that school, and both the black and the white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference. You can't imagine a more trivial program than that. One place left and both the black and the white child apply for it. Doesn't happen very often. But the Supreme Court examined this plan of both the Seattle and Louisville school districts, said it was unconstitutional. The majority, or not majority, the controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained that the schools in Louisville and Seattle, he said, yes, they were segregated. But he said the neighborhoods in which they were located was segregated was the reason for this school segregation. And he said that neighborhood segregation was de facto, the term he used. De facto segregation, and he went through all the reasons I described before. People liking to live with each other of the same race, bigoted homeowners not wanting to sell or rent to African Americans, actors in the private economy, income differences. All of these things comprise de facto segregation, not something that's unconstitutional because the government wasn't doing it. And the Chief Justice said, if you have de facto segregation, you're not permitted to do anything explicitly about it. As I said, what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that had happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of these two school districts some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb outside Louisville called Shively. That white homeowner in Shively had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville, renting an apartment. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a middle-class job, wife and a daughter. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would rent or sell him one. So the white homeowner in the suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They firebombed and dynamited the home. And when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal courts, the criminal justice system, the courts are all mobilized to maintain racial boundaries in Louisville, Kentucky. And I began to look into it a bit further. And I found in the course of my research that there were thousands of cases, thousands, not exaggerating, not just in border states like Kentucky, but in New York and in Chicago and in Pittsburgh and in Detroit and in Kansas City and Los Angeles and San Francisco, everywhere in the country. Thousands of cases of mob violence, frequently protected by the police, that drove African Americans in the mid-20th century out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police were involved in either protecting a mob, sometimes even instigating it, was a civil rights violation, a violation of the Constitution that we have never remedied and that we have an obligation to remedy. I then began to look into it further and found that it wasn't just police action, criminal courts action, that created the segregation that we know today, but there were many, many policies of the federal, state, and local governments that designed this country to be an apartheid nation. Without those policies, we would not be segregated in the way that we are. And that segregation determines the most serious social problems that we face. Right now in this country, we are obsessed, and we should be, about the way in which police forces treat African Americans. But that would not exist if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young Black people into segregated neighborhoods where the police assume the stance of an occupying force. We wouldn't have mass incarceration of young men if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to jobs or opportunity. The segregation that we have today determines not only the achievement gap and the mass incarceration that I've just mentioned, determines the health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, more of them, live in less healthy neighborhoods. There's more pollution of the kind that creates the asthma I talked about before, less access to healthy food. As a result, African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease. The segregation that we have also creates what I think is a very, very dangerous and frightening, and I assume many of you agree with me about this, a frightening political polarization in this country, which is not entirely racial, but it tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to preserve this democracy, which is under great threat, if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other, to empathize with each other, that could lead to a common national identity. So the segregation that we've created underlies the most serious social problems that we face. And so let me spend the next few minutes describing some of the major federal policies that created, sustained, reinforced this segregation. There are many, many other state and local policies and other federal policies as well that I won't have time to discuss, that I detail in The Color of Law, but I'll mention a couple of the major federal policies. One of them is public housing, something that I think most of us, probably maybe all of us, misunderstand. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men, as I indicated before, without jobs in the formal economy, without access to those jobs, engaging in oppositional behavior, deteriorated buildings. That's our image of public housing today. That's not how public housing began in this country. The first public housing in this country was created during the New Deal in the Roosevelt administration and the Depression, 1933. It was not for poor people. Poor people were not permitted into public housing when it was created. We had a large unemployment rate during the Depression. 25% of the workforce was unemployed, something like today. Public housing was not for that 25%. Public housing was for the 75% who had jobs, stable jobs, who could afford to pay full rent. It wasn't subsidized. The government built the housing and then collected rent to pay for it. And everywhere that the Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency to build this housing, everywhere it built it on a segregated basis, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. That may surprise some of you, but we had much more urban integration in the mid-20th century, early 20th century than we have today. The reason is not hard to understand. If you think about it, we were a manufacturing economy at that time. None of this internet stuff. It was all making things. And factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals. So the factories could get their parts and ship their final products by either a ship or by rail. If you had a factory district that was employing both African American and white workers, they all had to live relatively close to their places of employment. They didn't have cars to drive into the suburbs, so you had integrated neighborhoods, broadly integrated neighborhoods. The first project that the Public Works Administration built, the first ever public housing project in this country for civilians, was built in Atlanta in an integrated neighborhood near downtown Atlanta called the Flats. Atlanta had segregated schools and segregated water fountains and segregated lunch counters, but it had an integrated neighborhood near downtown. Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood to build a project for whites only. This was the federal government's project, forcing the African Americans who lived in the area that was demolished to build that housing to double, triple up with relatives elsewhere, find less adequate housing elsewhere. Throughout the country, the government in the New Deal followed such a policy. It built projects both for blacks and for whites, fewer for blacks, most for whites, all middle class, working class families. In Cleveland, you may be familiar with, well, I'm sure you are familiar with the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. In his autobiography, Hughes describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. It's called the Central Neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. This is what you would expect in an integrated neighborhood and an integrated high school. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built two separate projects creating segregation for the first time, one for whites, one for blacks in that neighborhood, and with projects elsewhere in Cleveland, reinforced and perpetuated segregation that we know there today. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to talk about self-satisfied smug places, think they're better than everybody else. Cambridge, Massachusetts, some of you may be familiar with it. The area between Harvard and MIT was a fully integrated neighborhood called the Central Square neighborhood, about half black, half white. Public Works Administration demolished housing there and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other projects elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area, reinforced and perpetuated that segregation to create the patterns in Boston that we know today. During World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. Not only had nothing been built during the Depression except for these few public projects, but we had thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers flocking to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries that hadn't previously been available. If the government wanted the ships and the tanks and the aircraft carriers and the planes to be produced, it had to somehow find housing for these workers who were flocking to these centers of war production, and it did. Everywhere that war plants existed, the government built housing for war workers, always on a segregated basis. Again, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously been known. The West Coast is a good example of that. The West Coast had very few African Americans residing here, where I am, before World War II. We divide the migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country into two big periods, the first Great Migration and the second Great Migration. It was the second Great Migration that brought African Americans in large numbers to the West Coast. So there were no previous patterns of segregation to speak of that the government could reinforce with its housing projects for war workers, but the government created segregation. In San Francisco, it built mostly shipyard workers. The government built 4 projects for whites only in white neighborhoods, and it built 1 project for African Americans in the Fillmore district that had previously been a center of Japanese American residents, and when the Japanese Americans were displaced, there were vacancies, and so the government decided that was going to be the black neighborhood of San Francisco, and it built a project for African Americans there, creating the African American district of San Francisco that lasted until the present gentrification that has driven most of them out. Everywhere in the country where there were war plants, the government perpetuated or created segregation with its housing for war workers. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. During the war, it was illegal to use construction materials for civilian purposes, except for the housing for war workers, people who were actually working in war plants. And then there were millions of returning war veterans coming home, needing housing, living in Quonset huts, double, triple up with relatives. We had a homelessness crisis much like we have today. The government somehow had to address this enormous housing crisis, and President Truman, who assumed the presidency upon Franklin Roosevelt's death at the end of World War II, proposed a vast expansion of the nation's public housing program. This wasn't again for poor people. This was for returning war veterans, people who had jobs in the post-war economy, people who could afford to pay rent in unsubsidized public housing units, but for whom no housing was available. Truman proposed a vast expansion of the public housing program. Conservatives in Congress, and I'm going to tell the story in some detail because it has enormous lessons for us today for the work that you do. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's expansion of public housing. Not for racial reasons, it was segregated, they didn't object to that. Not because they didn't like poor people. Public housing, for the most part, was not for poor people. People were paying rent because they had jobs. They wanted to defeat it because they said that public housing was socialistic. The private sector should be taking care of the housing needs of working class families. Not that the private sector was doing so any more than it's doing so today. But that was their rationale. And so they came up with a device that we call a poison pill strategy, a device to defeat a bill in Congress. A poison pill strategy is one where opponents of a bill come up with an amendment that they think can get a majority. And then when the amendment is passed and the full bill comes up on the floor of the House and the Senate, that amendment makes the full bill unpalatable to a different majority, and the bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress, maybe some of you are from Ohio, and remember Mr. Republican, Mr. Conservative, Senator Robert Taft of Chicago proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act that would expand public housing. An amendment that said that from now on, public housing has to be non-discriminatory, no more racial discrimination in public housing. Of course, it was a cynical amendment. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for it. They thought they could get Northern liberals to join them in voting for it. That would create a majority. The amendment would then be attached to the 1949 Housing Act. And when the full act came up on the floor of the House and the Senate, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who were content with segregated housing, but not integrated housing. And the bill will go down to defeat. So liberals in Congress faced a very, very difficult decision. I'm not minimizing the difficulty of the decision. I'm not minimizing the difficulty that housers today faced with a similar dilemma. Were they going to oppose the integration amendment in order to ensure the survival of the public housing expansion and address the very critical homelessness crisis that we were facing? Or were they going to support the integration amendment, as many of them wished to do, with the result that no additional public housing would be built because the bill would go down to defeat? It was not an easy decision, but they decided to oppose the integration amendment. The leading liberal in the Congress at that time was a senator from Illinois, Senator Paul Douglas. His closest associate was somebody whose name is probably more familiar to you. His closest associate was the senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey was called Mr. Civil Rights. Douglas and Humphrey decided to lead an effort to defeat the non-discrimination amendment in Congress. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and gave a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the non-discrimination amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the non-discrimination amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, he was persuasive. The amendment was defeated. Public housing was passed in the 1949 Housing Act and expanded on a segregated basis. The federal government used that vote in Congress as its justification for continuing to segregate all housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 13 years after that vote. I'm not so sure that Douglas was right, that anybody was better off, although it was a difficult decision, because the segregated public housing that we built that so reinforced the segregation of our cities, that followed from that 1949 Housing Act, created, as I say, an achievement gap in schools, health disparities, mass incarceration, dangerous political polarization. Those are the long-term costs of solving the immediate housing crisis that people were facing. As I say, we face the same dilemma today. We have an enormous, even before the pandemic, and we have it even to a greater extent now, an enormous housing crisis for low-income families in particular. affordable housing. And what we do is we build most of our affordable housing in low-income, already segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation, making the same bargain that Douglas and Humphrey made, because it's easier to build that housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods where there's no community opposition, where the land may be cheaper, where you don't face not only don't face community opposition, but where lots of low-income families live and can walk by and see for rent signs in the window. That's the choice we're making today. That's the choice that Douglas made. And we created that expansion of public housing on a segregated basis. Very soon after that, a development occurred that was surprising to housing officials. All of the white projects, giant towers that were built under the 1949 Housing Act, like the Robert Taylor homes or Cabrini Green, or in St. Louis, the Pruitt-Igoe homes, perhaps the most iconic of all those projects. It was actually two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites, two explicitly segregated projects. All the white projects started to develop large numbers of vacancies. The black projects had long waiting lists. Pretty soon, the situation became so conspicuous, so untenable, that even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where half the projects in the city were empty and the others had long waiting lists. Soon, all the projects were opened up to African Americans. Public housing became predominantly an African American institution in much of the country. At about the same time, industry left the cities. It no longer needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals. The highways were being built. We're talking now the early 1950s. Factories were leaving, moving to the suburbs, to rural areas. The jobs that had sustained urban residents for so many years began to disappear. They became poorer and poorer. The predominantly African-American public housing projects now required subsidies because people could no longer afford the full cost of the housing and their rent. And we got the kinds of urban slums that we associate with public housing today. Once the government had to subsidize them, it stopped maintaining them well, stopped investing in them, and the projects deteriorated. The question is, I hope you're asking yourselves, why did all the white projects develop large numbers of vacancies and the black projects have long waiting lists? All of these were working class families, many of them returning war veterans, black and white. Why such a difference in their need for public housing? Well, that was because of another federal program that was even more powerful than public housing in creating segregation in this country. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration to suburbanize the white working class population, to move them out of cities into single family homes in all white suburbs. This was a racially explicit program to move white working class families out of urban areas into single family homes in the suburbs. Explicit. You're familiar with the suburbanization, of course. We are now a suburban country. We were not at that time in the mid-20th century. The biggest of these projects, I know you're familiar with, Levittown, east of New York City, but they're all over the country. They created the suburbanization we know. Levittown, 17,000 homes in one place in Nassau County, east of New York. South of San Francisco, Westlake, 15,000 homes built at about the same time. And in every metropolitan area in between, suburbanization took place. These builders, developers like Levitt building Levittown, or Henry Dolger building Westlake, could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000, 15,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend them money to build those kinds of developments. They had no buyers yet. We weren't a suburban country. The bankers had no reason to believe that anybody would want to live in suburbs like that. They couldn't get the financing to build their developments without going to the Federal Housing Administration, the federal government, submitting their plans for the development. The plans included, the architectural designs they were going to use, the materials they were going to use, and a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required these developers to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was an explicit written federal policy. The Federal Housing Administration distributed a manual to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to evaluate the application of builders for bank guarantees for their loans. The manual prohibited the recommendation of federal bank guarantees for any developer who would sell to African Americans in a white project. The manual even provided that you could not give a bank guarantee to a loan to a developer who was going to build an all-white project if that project was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. This is how a white noose was created around every metropolitan area in this country with this federal policy. Well, the suburbs were built in that way. The homes at that time were very, very inexpensive, open only to whites. They sold at that time for, in today's money, about $100,000. Any working class family can afford a home sold for $100,000. That's about twice national median income. Black families could have afforded them easily. Returning war veterans didn't even have to come up with a down payment. No down payment required for returning war veterans. And so these suburbs were populated by whites only. African Americans required to remain, effectively required to remain in urban areas, either renting in the private market or subsidized in public housing. That's how we created the segregation that we know today. The white families who were subsidized to buy those homes in the mid-20th century saw their homes appreciate in value over the next few generations. $100,000 homes no longer sell for $100,000 today. You cannot buy a home in Levittown for $100,000. It's now $400,000, $500,000. In many parts of the country, these homes sell for $1 million or more. The white families who were subsidized to purchase these homes by the federal government gained over the next few generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to finance their own retirements. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, whether medical emergencies or unemployment. If you lose a job and you're unemployed and you have wealth, you can weather that unemployment, that temporary unemployment. If you lose a job and you don't have wealth, you're pushed further down the income scale permanently, the economic scale permanently. The result is that today, African-American incomes in this country are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. That's a big disparity, and there's a whole story behind that, largely involving federal policy. I'm not going to go into that now, but it's a 60% income ratio. African-American wealth is only 5% of white wealth on average, household wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that's never been remedied, and that we, all of us, have never taken it upon ourselves to remedy, the responsibility to remedy. That wealth gap, which underlies most of the social problems in this country today, the disadvantageous conditions in which African Americans continue to live. As I said at the very beginning, we passed the Fair Housing Act that says you can no longer discriminate against African Americans if they seek homes in white neighborhoods. But it's a meaningless right if you don't have a down payment for those homes, and the homes have appreciated so much in value that homes that were once affordable to African Americans, from which they were excluded, are no longer affordable. There are many, many other policies, as I say, that I've described in my book, The Color of Law, that were used by government to create segregation. The Internal Revenue Service granted tax exemptions to nonprofit organizations, churches that were leaders in efforts to segregate their neighborhoods, state licensing agencies, licensed real estate agents who subscribed to a national code of ethics that prohibited them from selling homes in white neighborhoods to African American families. We have a whole nexus of policies that make up de jure segregation, unconstitutional segregation. Our racial boundaries, our apartheid landscape is just as unconstitutional as the segregation of buses or water fountains or swimming pools. And we've never remedied it. The ways to remedy this are easy to develop. They're not hard to figure out what to do about it. What's missing is not ideas about how to remedy racial segregation. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to undertake the task of making it uncomfortable to maintain the current system of segregation. It involves much, much more than police reform, which is essential. It involves sacrifices on the part of the rest of the country to remedy the unconstitutional system that we have responsibility for creating. For example, we should have, and it would be constitutionally justified, we should have an affirmative action program in housing. African Americans should be subsidized by the federal government to move into suburbs, all white suburbs, that are no longer affordable to them, but that would have been affordable to them in the mid-20th century had they been permitted to live there. As I mentioned earlier, we have programs for low-income families that subsidize their housing and that reinforce segregation. The biggest is the low-income housing tax credit that gives a subsidy to builders to build low-income housing. As I said earlier, a disproportionate share of those are placed in low-income communities that reinforces segregation. As you probably know, this is something that's in your wheelhouse. The federal Treasury Department regulations place a premium on placing low-income housing in low-income, already segregated neighborhoods. The Section 8 voucher program works in the same way for low-income families. Most Section 8 vouchers are placed in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, partly because of zoning laws that in non-low-income segregated neighborhoods that limit the amount of affordable housing that can be built. So even if a family wants to move to a higher opportunity neighborhood, it can't do so. Many other policies. We have I use the word myth too often, but we have this notion, too many of us, that this country is divided between middle-class families, white and low-income minority families. There is a vast African-American middle and working class that can afford housing if it were being built, but for whom no housing is available outside segregated neighborhoods. Teachers, nurses, construction workers. We have a missing middle in the housing programs that we pursue, that we don't address the segregation of middle and working class African-American families, because that would require changing zoning rules, which white neighborhoods resist. That would require subsidies in many cases to remedy the policies that we implemented in the mid-20th century. Unless we have that new civil rights movement, there won't be any remedy to this, no matter how much we march and demonstrate over incidents, outrageous incidents of police brutality. We need to go beyond those and deal with the more serious underlying structural problems in our economy that maintain our segregation and maintain the conditions under which those police practices can persist. I hope there will be such a new civil rights movement. I'm optimistic that the increased awareness that we see around us every day now about racial discrimination, about our history of slavery and Jim Crow will translate into a movement to redress segregation. I'm hopeful about it. I'm not confident about it. That's up to you. that's up to Americans generally around the country about whether they join such a civil rights movement. Before the pandemic shut down, I was working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create a network of local committees around the country to redress segregation, residential segregation. We'll resume on that effort once life returns to something like normal in this country. And I hope all of you will support it and join it. If you're interested in being on the mailing list to receive information about that new civil rights movement, once we are ready to launch it, you can send me an email. My email address is easily available. Just look me up on the web at the Economic Policy Institute, and I'll put you on that list to be notified. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I'd be glad to engage in questions and discussion at this point for as much time as you have. Thanks very much.
And thank you, Mr. Rothstein. And thank you, Mr. Rothstein. We really appreciate you being with us today to talk with us about your book, The Color of Law, and the impact of residential segregation in the United States. We have several questions from our membership who would like to engage directly with you and get some more information. We also have several people who are expressing appreciation for your work and for your book, including me, who has found your book extremely helpful, as NCRC has done some work, particularly around the HOLC, what are commonly known as the redlining maps that were done back in the 1930s, and what the current effects of those are. But Dr. Mary Manigan says, I'm very excited at this webinar. She was looking very much forward to seeing you at our conference. She just wanted you to know that your book inspired her dissertation, which explored the federal government's role in segregating neighborhoods in Jackson, Mississippi.
I assume she'll send me a copy, right?
Hopefully. One of the points in your book is this issue about segregation and how segregation wasn't widespread in the North at the time, although it was in the South in the early part of the 20th century. And the role of government in basically imposing segregation and on neighborhoods that were otherwise integrated. Could you tell us a bit more about how federal policy is implicated in this imposition of segregation in the North?
Well, most of what I talked about was about the North, but I don't want to mislead you. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't informal segregation before in the North, in many cities before federal policy intervened. There certainly was, but that informal segregation would not have created the segregated landscape that we know today had the federal government not stepped in, beginning in the New Deal, to reinforce and strengthen it and expand it. So, for example, I talked a few minutes ago about Levittown, to take that example. What if, let me just say, yes, there was certainly segregation in New York at that time, informal segregation. But what if the federal government had told William Levitt that if you want a bank guarantee for your loans to build this 17,000 home suburb, we won't give you a bank guarantee unless you agree to sell it on a non-discriminatory basis, sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis. There were many African Americans who would want to move there just as whites wanted to. And I actually describe in The Color of Law a particular family, Black family, that was a middle-class family, a businessman who was excluded from that neighborhood. Well, the federal government had told Levitt that. Now, Levitt was a bigot. He wouldn't have liked it. If he was left on his own, he would have only sold to whites. But what if the federal government had followed its constitutional obligation and made that a requirement, non-segregation? Levitt would have had a choice, not to build a development at all or go along with a non-segregation policy. And had he done so, we would have a much more integrated New York State, and along with other developers like him, that we have today. So it's not that there was no informal segregation prior to the federal government policies. But the federal government policies expanded it, reinforced it, and perpetuated it to an extent that we otherwise would not have known. It would not be nearly as rigid today as it is if it were not for this policy.
That's interesting. Now, aside from federal government policy, there were other factors in place in the early part of the 20th century. Issues like covenants and deeds that actually had discrimination actively written into them as ways of preserving a segregated character to neighborhoods. Baltimore attempted to pass a residential segregation act within the city of Baltimore, which was subsequently struck down by the Supreme Court. Could you talk a little bit about these early attempts and the role of zoning in segregation in the early 20th century?
All right, you've bundled three different questions, three different issues into that question. So let me take them one by one. Deeds. I mentioned before that the Federal Housing Administration required developers like Dolger or Levitt or any of the others to place clauses in the deeds that prohibited resale or rental to African Americans. Of course, the Federal Housing Administration didn't invent those deeds. They had been, they started actually, I think, mostly in Kansas City, where a builder there developed a whole subdivision privately earlier in the 20th century with these kinds of restrictive deeds called covenants in place to prevent any African Americans from living in the communities. But the federal government, again, embraced this private practice, reinforced it, required it where what otherwise was not already in place. In 1948, the Supreme Court prohibited state courts from enforcing the deeds. Didn't prohibit the deeds, but it prevented state courts from enforcing the deeds. Previously, if an African American were to move into a white neighborhood with such a deed, the white neighbors could go to court and sue to have the African American evicted. And this was done in thousands of cases of these kinds of evictions of African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased because they were bought in violation of a restrictive deed. The Supreme Court said you could no longer enforce them. But they continued, as the Federal Housing Administration and real estate agents, even though they could no longer enforce them, continued to develop subdivisions with federal help that were for whites only. So the prohibition of deeds had some, of restrictive deeds had some effect, but it didn't totally end it. It wasn't until 1962 that President Kennedy issued an executive order prohibiting federal agencies from requiring segregation as a condition of their policy. 1962, it's pretty recent. And at least to me, it's pretty recent. That continued, and that 1962 executive order, of course, would not have been necessary had not the federal government been pursuing a policy of segregation before then. So that's the first question you asked. The second had to do with zoning rules that were adopted in many border states, or cities and border states like Baltimore and Louisville, Kentucky, and others in the early 20th century that prohibited, generally they prohibited African Americans from moving onto a block that was majority white, and it prohibited whites from moving onto a block that was majority black. Now again, if you think about it, that those zoning rules would have had no meaning, no use if they weren't segregated, if they weren't integrated neighborhoods, if they weren't integrated neighborhoods beforehand. If whites weren't moving on to majority black blocks and blacks weren't moving on to majority white blocks, those zoning rules would have had no purpose. The Supreme Court prohibited those kinds of zoning rules in a 1917 decision, not for racial reasons. It had nothing to do with racial equity. It had to do with the Supreme Court's view at that time that the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to protect property rights, and such zoning rules prohibited a property owner from selling to whomever he pleased. But soon after that, Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s, created a national committee on zoning that was whose purpose was to develop zoning rules that would be adopted by jurisdictions all over the country that weren't explicitly racial to go around the Supreme Court decision, but that would effectively exclude most low-income families from existing residential neighborhoods. And that's the origin of the zoning rules that we have today. We continue to adopt them. Zoning rules that, for example, require only single-family homes to be built in the neighborhood, or even require large lot sizes for those homes that prohibit even townhouses or duplexes that effectively perpetuate segregation. But the origin of those zoning rules was a Hoover committee in the 1920s that was designed to evade the Supreme Court's prohibition on explicitly racial zoning. And I guess I answered the question about contemporary zoning just now as well.
Great. So even our zoning rules have some basis in this effort to segregate American society. And then in your book and also in your discussion, you've talked some about the mob violence that was involved in when Black people attempted to buy into white residential areas. For instance, the incident in Shively, Kentucky, in which the homeowner ends up being charged with sedition. What year did that occur? Because that was fairly late, right?
It was in the 1950s. I think it was 1956, 4. I don't recall exactly. It was in the 1950s.
Right. So subsequent efforts, laws, Kennedy's executive order in 1962, the FHA in 1968, an attempt at a positive, to impose a positive obligation on banks to loan with CRA in 1977. These are all recent efforts to try and address these issues. Can you think now, in our current time, what sort of legislative remedies could possibly be available?
Well, I think I mentioned that, and they're tough. They're tough. I know that you're concerned with the CRA, as am I, but the CRA itself is not going to make as big a dent in this as we need. For one thing, the CRA is primarily concerned with investing. I don't know why it's called the Reinvestment Act. We've never invested in these communities, but it's primarily concerned with investing in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods with the view that if you do that, you're going to revitalize, or I guess again, not but you're going to vitalize those neighborhoods. It's never happened. We've tried time after time to enact programs that increase investment in low-income neighborhoods, and they don't succeed. We had enterprise zones, we've had empowerment zones, we've had, now we have the Trump administration's version of that, and the Community Reinvestment Act. What we need is not only investment in those neighborhoods, but we need the opening of exclusive white neighborhoods to African Americans who were unconstitutionally excluded from them by past policy. And that requires, as I say, it requires subsidies. It requires subsidies, affirmative action in housing, because the segregated white neighborhoods that we created with these policies are no longer affordable to working class families of any race. But it's the ones who were explicitly excluded by unconstitutional policy were African Americans. If we, and then I mentioned earlier, I want to emphasize this again, that in our housing policies, we have a missing middle. We have subsidies that are available for people with mostly up to 60% average median income, in some cases up to 80% average median income. And then we have market rate housing. Well, you know, the 60% of average median income in this country is $36,000 a year. 80% is, you know, less than $50,000 a year. In which urban area in this country can you buy a home if you have an income of $50,000 a year? The whole difference between market rate, which, you know, is probably in some places it's 120% of average and median income, in some places it's much more than that. We are making no provision for the difference between people with 60% average median income, or in some cases 80%, rare cases 80% average median income, and market rate housing. And that's the vast majority of African Americans who are working class, who have jobs, who need housing, and are living in segregated neighborhoods. And we need, and to work within the framework of current policy, which makes no provision for this missing middle, is a way to perpetuate segregation. So we need policies that address that missing middle, and that will require opening up suburban areas. It will require subsidies, affirmative action programs that are justified on the basis of past unconstitutional discrimination.
Unconstitutional discrimination, that's one of your key points, that there have been a series of decisions really made over time that are in violation of the constitutional. And one of our participants asked, have any class action lawsuits been filed to address or to force subsidies to be given because of these constitutional violations?
No, and it can't be done that way. I'm not suggesting that civil rights lawyers will be put out of business. They'll have a lot to do defending policies that are enacted legislatively. But at this point, there is no class, no members of a class that could have standing to demand these kinds of policies that we need. An analogy is higher education. We don't have affirmative action in higher education because African Americans sue universities saying they should be given extra preference. We have affirmative action to the extent we have any left, but when we did have it, and we still have it in a few places, to the extent we have affirmative action in higher education, it's because regents or university administrators have enacted a policy to give some preference to people who've historically been excluded from higher education. And those policies have to be defended in court against people who are opposed to affirmative action and want to challenge it. So, for example, the lead case is in the University of Texas, where the state of Texas adopted an affirmative action policy. It adopted it not as a result of a class action suit, but because it was a necessary policy to remedy past exclusion. Conservatives challenged that policy, and it went through the courts, and the courts upheld it to a limited extent. So the same thing is true of housing and segregation, housing segregation. We need enacted legislative policies, which can only happen because of popular demand, because we have a new civil rights movement that makes it uncomfortable to maintain segregation. Once those policies are enacted, of course, there are going to be legal struggles to defend them, and the civil rights movement will have to defend those policies. But they can't be started with a class action suit. African Americans today are too far distant from the mid-20th century policies that created the segregation. Nobody can come into court today and say that if, to use the example I was given before, if only my great-grandfather were permitted to buy into Levittown, I would be middle class today. That's too far distant that you can't identify the particular victims in that way. The victims are African Americans generally who live in a segregated environment.
So in terms of policy remedies today, we have Kelly asking, What's your opinion of the low-income housing tax credit program and its ability to remedy segregation?
Well, as I said, I spoke about this earlier. For one thing, most low-income housing tax credit developments are placed in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. For one thing, there's no community opposition to it. You don't have to hold 100 community meetings explaining to people in a high opportunity white neighborhood why you're bringing black and brown people into their neighborhood. The zoning laws make it virtually impossible in many cases to build multifamily developments in a high opportunity neighborhood. Land is cheaper in low-income segregated neighborhoods. As I said, they're easy to rent. You don't have to advertise them very widely. So most low-income housing tax credit programs are placed in low-income segregated neighborhoods. The other problem with them is, as I indicated earlier, is they provide financing only for families up to 60% average median income. In some cases, under a recent regulation, you can do average incomes using 80% average median income. But still, you don't create useful desegregation by creating developments that have market rate on the one hand and only low-income units on the other. For meaningful non-segregation, you need mixed income housing, and there are no public financing available for truly mixed income housing. I don't mean mixing the lowest and the highest, but as I say, the missing middle. There are no public financing tools available, and the private sector is incapable. It's incapable of building housing, workforce housing for moderate working class families and make a profit. It's in many communities, the land is too expensive. The construction costs are too high. And so we have a crisis where affordable housing for working class families cannot be built profitably, and we have no public program to do it. We need public housing like we had in the early 20th century for working class families. Good public housing. It was the most desirable housing available during the Depression and after World War II. Families, white and black, were lined up to get it. It was the most desirable housing available. We need those programs again, where some units are subsidized for low-income families, but many units are sold at rented at market rate, but where there's public financing because the private sector is focused on building housing for the affluent, as it was in the 30s and the 40s as well.
So you've talked about public policy directly assisting in public housing, in the building of public housing. How about the lending industry itself? Lending, particularly after the Second World War with the VA and FHA loans, was there's a particular point in your book where you talk about how this lending, because of the way it was structured, mainly benefited white families, and black families were prohibited from taking advantage of that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there are many reforms that are needed with the lending industry. For one thing, the banks that participated in the unconstitutional programs of the federal government in the mid-20th century that would not lend to African Americans, even in black neighborhoods. That was called redlining, as you mentioned before, that would not lend to African Americans to move into white neighborhoods. Those banks have an obligation to remedy their own discriminatory behavior. They should be setting up funds to provide down payment assistance for people against whose ancestors they discriminated and refused to allow to move. As you know, better than I do, these are things that you're expert in. I'm just a novice, but as you know, credit eligibility is fashioned in a discriminatory basis. You don't get credit for paying your rent on time. You don't get, but you get credit for paying loans for cars or boats or other middle-class purchases. And so credit scoring discriminates against African Americans. We know that there's still steering of African Americans by real estate agents and bank practices as well. There was a widely reported, I'm sure many of your attendees are familiar with this, a widely reported survey that the Long Island Newsday did last fall, showing that racial steering is still a big problem in this country, even where African Americans can afford to purchase homes. They're steered away from homes in high opportunity neighborhoods. Bank lending suffers from the same problems. And so we have a lot of work to do simply in enforcing the Fair Housing Act. I'm not in no way minimizing the importance of enforcing the Fair Housing Act more rigorously than we've done in the past. Certainly the subprime lending crisis, where we know that banks targeted minorities, African Americans and Hispanics, for exploitative refinancing mortgage loans with exploding interest rates and exploitative refinancing provisions. Federal regulators should have been on top of that. They weren't. They were complicit in it. But in addition to enforcing the Fair Housing Act, which would, if it was fully enforced, give African Americans the ability to purchase homes that they can afford. We need to address the issue of their lack of affordability that was created by a pattern of unconstitutional policy. That's the big issue that we can't avoid. And without that issue, without addressing the wealth gap as a perpetuator of housing segregation, simply, even if we were effective in abolishing discrimination, would not do much to fix this.
So we have one question here from Frank and Carolyn. They're asking, how has housing segregation impacted other sectors like investment, minority businesses, banking, and even divisions of, I guess, religious institutions? It seems like they want to talk beyond just residential segregation to how that's impacted businesses and other aspects within neighborhoods.
Well, I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. Certainly when you concentrate the lowest income families in single neighborhoods, the retail sector does not flourish in those neighborhoods because people don't have the money to buy. Because people have few choices, there's less competition. The result is that, for example, I mentioned earlier, and you all know this, the presence of markets selling fresh food, fresh fruits and vegetables, healthy food, is very limited in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. Markets would rather invest in places where people can pay high prices. And so the retail sector is starved there. This is why I say that simply trying to invest in low-income neighborhoods is not a solution to the segregation that we have. We have to do both. We certainly should invest in low-income neighborhoods, but we also need to create opportunities of choice for people who live in those neighborhoods so that they can find housing and afford housing in higher opportunity places.
So residential segregation concentrated disadvantage along a number of different dimensions within neighborhoods. Something that is perhaps more encouraging, Bob from San Francisco writes, are you encouraged about the growing trends of young millennials and Generation Z with a growing interest in mixed racial neighborhoods? And what are policies that are needed to support this growing interest? And I think Bob's talking about neighborhoods, integrated neighborhoods in some areas like Washington, D.C., where you see an increasing mix of stable integrated neighborhoods across the country.
Well, I don't know that you see a mix of stable integrated neighborhoods, a trend. They are transitionally integrated. the term that we use, you all know it, is gentrification, as wealthier or higher income millennials and Generation Z people move into these neighborhoods. More and more existing residents who are lower income are forced out of those neighborhoods. It takes some time, but eventually the pattern has been that neighborhoods that used to be low income minority flip to being equally segregated as higher income, mostly white neighborhoods, and the previous residents get forced out and displaced to even less healthy neighborhoods, frequently farther away from jobs and opportunity in outer ring suburbs. We know what the policies are. It certainly, I think, gentrification is a positive force if it's controlled so that we do create the kind of stable, integrated neighborhoods that you describe, but it's not controlled at this point. The only way to control it is to, in those neighborhoods, have effective rent control that prevents people from being forced out of the homes that they rent as the rents rise, as more affluent or middle-class whites move in. We need limits on condominium conversions. That's another policy that needs to be implemented. We need a requirement of inclusionary housing. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about just including the lowest income people, but working class families, middle class families, minority families who lived in those neighborhoods, but who can no longer afford to live them unless we have protections. And one of the protections is we need to limit the rise in property taxes in those neighborhoods for African-American or Hispanic or previous residents, for homeowners, existing homeowners, who may have paid off their homes, but who are forced to leave those neighborhoods because of rising property taxes as the land values increase. So whites moving into those neighborhoods is a healthy phenomenon if it can be stabilized. But the notion that it remains stabilized, I don't think is accurate. We see many cities where the process has advanced farther than in others, but there are many African Americans in Washington, D.C. that have been displaced in this process. Near where I live in Oakland, California, what used to be a mostly African American and Hispanic community is now rapidly gentrifying, and families are being pushed out to distant suburbs where they have no access to jobs. So we know, again, what the policies are. As I say, rent control, limits on condominium conversions, property tax freezes, inclusionary zoning that requires not just low income, but middle income units to be provided. We know what the policies are, but we're not politically mobilized to demand them. And the result is that we're seeing flipping of low income segregated neighborhoods into higher income segregated neighborhoods.
So neighborhood revitalization without displacement.
Yes.
It's really what's needed.
Yes.
Very good. We have a question here regarding, we've talked a lot about how the African American community has been impacted by residential segregation and governmental policies, but how about other communities such as Asians and the Hispanic community? Were there similar segregationist sort of measures against those communities also?
Well, certainly, but remember that most of the policies that I described that created ongoing patterns that we still live with today were implemented in the mid-20th century, where the overwhelming share of low-income minorities in the North, in the East, in the Southeast, and the Midwest were African American. Certainly in Texas and California, Colorado to some extent, there was also state-sponsored discrimination against Hispanics. Much earlier in the 20th century, there was state-sponsored discrimination, all unconstitutional, against Asians, Chinese in particular. You all know that we displaced, I mentioned this earlier, we displaced Japanese Americans from their homes during World War II. But the policies I described were directed specifically against African Americans because that was the minority who was living in Washington and in New York and in Chicago and in Detroit. Hispanics hadn't yet moved in significant numbers to those communities. Now, of course, once we create segregated patterns, even if they were initially directed at African Americans, they affect others as well. And the solutions, the remedies that we should pursue will benefit more than just African Americans. If, for example, we abolish exclusionary zoning in high opportunity neighborhoods and permit the construction of townhouses and garden apartments, multifamily units, other minorities besides African Americans will have greater opportunities. So they will benefit from it. If we modify the Section 8 program, many Hispanics who have Section 8 vouchers will be able to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. So they will benefit as well.
Here's a question from Nikhil. How do you think the American culture that values home ownership as a status symbol perpetuates segregation? Is it necessary to close the home ownership gap, to close segregation, or may it be done predominantly through rentals? And this whole idea of home ownership as being I guess, a cultural value, that goes way back to what Herbert Hoover and the promotion of home ownership during the early 20th century, right, as an American value. Could you talk a little bit about that and about its relationship with the rentals?
Well, both are necessary. We need access of African Americans and to rentals in higher opportunity communities, as well as home ownership. I want to emphasize that the idea has been going around lately. I see a lot of it that home ownership is the way to address the wealth gap. Certainly, it could be, but most African Americans who have owned homes have owned them in neighborhoods that haven't appreciated in value the way white neighborhoods have. So home ownership is not an automatic guarantee of wealth. You have to buy a home in a neighborhood that's about to gentrify, but that hasn't yet, so that you can take advantage of rising values of that home. If you buy a home in a neighborhood that's not appreciating in value, you won't gain wealth. An equally important way to gain wealth is through income policy. If African Americans, if we didn't have such an absurdly low minimum wage, if we didn't have the effective abolition of the right to organize trade unions, African American incomes could rise and African Americans could save more out of their incomes. So long as the income gap is so great, saving is not going to be possible. So we need both. We need home ownership in appreciating neighborhoods and rentals with higher incomes so that people can save in order to address the wealth gap.
You've talked some about the role of zoning in our current issues with housing. There's been a movement for densification, increasing densification in areas and changing of zoning laws within cities. We have a question from Jean Dahlquist saying, if code and zoning were reformed and if discriminatory zoning and integrated housing was possible, why do you say the private sector cannot create workforce housing today?
They can't create it because housing costs are too great. The construction costs are too great. We have good things like fire codes and building codes. I'm not opposed to them. They're wonderful things. But they've driven up the price of construction to such an extent, including land values, that it's very difficult for the private sector to do this. It's certainly, I agree with your questioner that increased density will make it more possible. But unless you increase density more than the kinds of policies that are being talked about in places like Minneapolis and Portland, where you can, build 3 units instead of 1, you need to do more than that in order to make housing affordable for working and middle-class families.
Here's another question. Can you say something about the role of down payment assistance, community land trusts, self-help housing programs in addressing segregation? When you talk about subsidy, I'm wondering if you have thoughts about specific types of subsidies.
How many hours do we have left?
Big question there.
Yes, I know, yes, land trusts is one tool. There are many tools to do this. Land trusts, down payment assistance, both of these are implemented in a few places. I don't have time to go into it now. I think we're almost out of time. But yes, there are many, many tools to do this. I think down payment assistance is another way of talking about the kind of affirmative action in housing policy that I was talking about before. Land trusts are another way of doing it.
Well, Mr. Rothstein, I think that's the end of the questions we have here, and we certainly appreciate your time today and helping us to understand the role of segregation, residential segregation, and how it has structured the American landscape, and also contributed to the racial wealth gap in the United States. I thank you on behalf of our membership.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we're no longer live at this point.
We are. We're just leaving the slide up for a little bit.
Okay, very good.